When I first started earning a little bit of surplus income, something strange happened that I didn't notice for months. When I had no money, going to a restaurant with friends wasn't even a question. It wasn't a choice I debated, it simply didn't exist inside my reality. But the moment an extra couple $100 landed in my bank account, eating out every single week quietly became the new normal. It wasn't a conscious celebration, it was an invisible ratchet. Without realizing it, things that used to be rare luxuries had transformed into my non-negotiable weekly baseline. And by the end of the month, despite earning more than I ever had, my bank balance was sitting at the exact same number it always did: 0. If you've ever watched your income climb over the last 2 years, only to realize that your savings, your peace of mind, and your actual financial breathing room haven't expanded by a single inch, you know this feeling. You tell yourself that you just need better discipline. You download another budgeting app, promise yourself you'll cut back next month, and resolve to try harder. And then, the exact same cycle repeats. The conventional advice in finance treats this as a moral defect or a math error. It tells you to track every penny, skip the coffee, and just force yourself to think long-term. But that advice fails because it attacks a symptom while completely ignoring the biological machine running underneath. You are not failing to build wealth because you lack budgeting tips. You are caught in a cognitive phenomenon known as the bandwidth tax. To understand why broke people stay broke, you have to look at what financial constraint actually does to human cognition. When your resources are tight, your brain does not operate in an open, strategic state. It enters chronic survival mode. Every unpaid bill, every uncertain expense, and every calculation at the grocery store acts like a background program running on your mental operating system, quietly draining your active cognitive RAM. Behavioral scientists call this the bandwidth tax. When your cognitive bandwidth is occupied by the constant, low-grade friction of financial limitation, your brain physically loses the capacity for executive function, impulse control, and long-range planning. In a state of cognitive scarcity, the brain is biologically engineered to heavily discount the future. Long-term compounding feels like an abstract fairy tale, while immediate relief becomes a biological necessity. And that is where the trap snaps shut. When you spend your days operating under chronic stress and mental exhaustion, your nervous system demands a counterweight. It cannot sustain that level of negative tension indefinitely. And so, the brain reaches for the fastest, most accessible emotional anesthetic it knows: consumption. Think about the purchases you make when you are stressed, bored, or feeling inadequate. That late-night online order, that impromptu expensive dinner, that small upgrade you didn't plan for. It is rarely about the utility of the object. It is about buying a temporary pulse of dopamine to make the blandness, the exhaustion, and the pressure of your daily life dissipate for an hour. Spending becomes a psychological band-aid. But because that band-aid drains the very surplus that could have bought your freedom, it deepens the financial constraint, which triggers more stress, which drives the next round of compensatory spending. It is a self-reinforcing loop. Now, pause for a moment and consider what happens when a person caught in this loop finally gets a raise. What do you think their psychology does with that extra $1,000? If the problem were purely financial, the extra income would immediately accumulate into an asset safety net. But that is almost never what occurs. Instead, a second mechanism takes over: identity homeostasis. When your income goes up, your external baseline immediately expands to match your new capacity. You move into a slightly nicer apartment, buy higher-tier groceries, subscribe to new services, and say yes to higher-friction social outings. Within 90 days, the new lifestyle feels completely ordinary. It becomes your identity baseline. And once a baseline is established, attempting to lower it triggers intense psychological resistance. To your ego and your nervous system, scaling back your lifestyle doesn't feel like a smart financial adjustment. It feels like an existential demotion. It feels like backward momentum. And the people around you, operating at that same social baseline, will subtly reinforce the pressure to maintain the facade. Your psychology auto-corrects to keep you spending at the exact boundary of your income. This is the central paradox. You cannot solve a consumption-driven identity crisis with frugality. Restricting your spending through raw willpower while maintaining a consumer identity is like holding your breath underwater. You can do it for 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. But eventually, the psychological deprivation becomes unbearable. You gasp for air, and you binge right back to where you started. The only way to permanently break the scarcity loop is not to tighten the leash on your spending. It is to execute an identity shift from consumer to producer. Years ago, when I read The Millionaire Next Door, I was struck by a fundamental reality that completely dismantled my understanding of money. The truly wealthy individuals in the real world are almost never the ones displaying flashy, high-consumption lifestyles. Real wealth is entirely unseen. Wealth is the assets quietly generating cash flow in the background. Wealth is the 6-month emergency safety net that allows you to walk away from a toxic environment without blinking. Wealth is the sovereignty of owning your time. When I realized that consumption was just an emotional anesthetic for a lack of purpose and sovereignty, my entire focus shifted. I stopped asking, what can I buy to feel better right now? And started asking, how does this system actually work? I redirected my cognitive bandwidth into building skills, understanding business architecture, analyzing marketing mechanisms, and creating assets. When your active mental energy is poured into producing value, learning high-leverage skills, and building something durable, the psychological urge to buy useless objects as an emotional crutch naturally evaporates. You no longer need consumption to feel alive because the act of creation is already doing that job. To make this practical in your own life, you don't need 100 complex budgeting rules. You need 3 non-negotiable mental filters. First, the 10x affordability rule. If you cannot buy 10 of an item in cash right now and still maintain complete financial breathing room, you cannot afford one. If buying it leaves you at the edge of your margin, it is not a purchase. It is a liability disguised as a treat. Second, the vital ROI filter. Before spending money on anything beyond basic survival, ask whether the expenditure directly increases your earning potential, measurably enhances your physical, mental, or spiritual health, or provides critical infrastructure. If it doesn't meet one of those criteria, ignore it. Third, the producer shift. Whenever you catch yourself browsing for a purchase out of boredom, frustration, or fatigue, recognize the anesthetic reflex in real time. Instead of spending your surplus on temporary comfort, channel that cognitive bandwidth into skill acquisition and stacking sovereign assets. Financial sovereignty is not about depriving yourself of life. It is about understanding that true freedom is bought with the money you don't spend on things you don't need. When you reclaim your cognitive bandwidth from the trap of scarcity, you stop funding an inflated baseline and you start building a financial machine that works for you while you sleep. Stop being the consumer the modern economic engine expects you to be. Become the producer who commands it.